Thank you. Before I start, I was touched by something that Jay said when he used the phrase stranger in a strange land, which of course is the title of a very famous science fiction novel by Robert Heinlein. But even more, it's what Moses said when he named his first child Gershom, which means stranger or alien in Hebrew, because as Moses said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. And that phrase has stayed with me ever since I read the book of Exodus. I'm going to tell you about my father and my mother. The year is 1931. In a remote village in the Punjab in India is a young man of 26 with a wife aged 15. What makes him leave behind his wife, his recently widowed mother, his younger brothers and sisters, because he's the eldest in the family, and set off to a faraway country, Britain. A country he knows almost nothing about. He doesn't know a single word of English. The answer is dire poverty. He was an economic migrant, a phrase that's become very unfashionable recently. His own father had died recently due to an accident during a fight with a neighbour. The family owned very little land, and he'd heard that there was more opportunity in Britain. Because even in 1931, there were already other people from that village there, and also people from other nearby villages. In the audience is my closest friend, Mohammed Amin, and his father came to the UK 4 years earlier, in 1927. So scraping the money together, he bought a ticket to Southampton. And then showing a piece of paper with an address in Manchester, somehow he found his way from Southampton to Manchester. Somebody obviously helped him to buy a train ticket, etc. We know that he liked Manchester. He liked it so much that apart from 3 short years from 1947 to 1950, he spent the rest of his life here and is buried in Southern Cemetery. Arriving at the bottom of the Depression, there was no work. Like many others, he bought a suitcase full of clothes from a warehouse, and many of these warehouses in Manchester were owned by Jewish merchants, and he bought those clothes on credit. And the rest of the week was spent knocking on doors as a door-to-door salesman. The next weekend, he'd pay for that first batch of clothes, have some money left over, and buy another suitcase worth of clothes on credit. And that was what he did for a living. In the early 1940s, he heard from somebody that there was money in wrestling. And he started going to the YMCA to work out. And when I was growing up in the 1950s, my father still had some of his old chest expanders, those stringy, stretchy things. I used to play with them. And his wrestling title was The Great Mirban. I've often thought about going through old newspaper archives to see if I could find some of his bouts, but I just never, ever had the time. There was one electronic archive I found, but there was nothing in there. In later life, he was a manual worker, including his longest job at the Northwestern Gas Board. And my first job in 1969, voluntarily between school and university, was working alongside him. It was hard work, and I lasted about a week and a half. That's the kind of hard work that he went through. Let me tell you also about my mother. Her first child, a daughter, was born after my father set off for the UK in 1931. And sadly, she died about the age of 13 of an infection, because child mortality in India was very high at that time. So my father never saw his first daughter. My father only went back to India, or in fact Pakistan, after partition in 1947. It took him 6 months going from refugee camp to refugee camp until he found his family. And they settled in the Pakistani part of the Punjab. They had a daughter. But my father preferred being in Britain. He just didn't feel happy there, didn't like it. And he came back here in 1950. And that time, my mother was pregnant, although they didn't know it, and I was born later that year. Sadly, a year or so later, my sister, who was a year or so older than me, she also died of an infection. And when my father received a letter telling him, he decided that after losing 2 children that way, he wrote back to my mother saying to her, "You have to come to the UK with our son." And in those days, wives had no choice but to do what their husband wanted. For years afterwards, my mother hated being in the UK. She was so far away from her own mother, she never saw her own mother again, because eventually when her mother became ill and died, the family simply couldn't afford for my mother to go back to Pakistan to see her. She hated being away from her brothers and sisters and everything she had known. But she stayed here because she knew that there was no education in Pakistan, in our village, for me, and she wanted me to be educated. And what I've described are the kind of sacrifices that migrants have made throughout history for the better lives of their children. And that's what's always driven me on. Educationally, to Cambridge, and to my professional career, where I became the first partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers. And have I got some time left? A minute. Let me just touch on contributions to society, because I reckon the taxpayer made a net loss on my parents, undoubtedly. My mother did some work, but not very much. My father paid taxes all his life, but not very much compared with the pension that he got. But in my own life, I have paid so much in taxes that it would have covered my father, my mother, myself, my education, my pension, my sister, because that's how it often works in migration. And to simply look at what one person does is not enough. And the other story that I'm particularly proud of, one day my father, for Eid, the meal that you have after Ramadan, or in fact this was probably Eid al-Adha because there was a sheep involved, he fed all of his friends, he organized the meal, he did all the cooking himself, and then they wanted to pass a plate round to, collect some money to sort of reimburse him. And he refused the reimbursement and instead insisted that they bank it. They opened a brand new bank account because he wanted to build a mosque in Manchester. That bank account is the original bank account of the Central Mosque in Manchester, although most of the money that paid towards it, of course, came much later on from some Memon merchants, which you'll find on their website. Thank you.